what ends up happening is you run into this situation where you think, oh, if it's not perfect data, I can't do anything. So I'm not going to collect any data, right? You get into this very binary mindset. And the result of that is you essentially run into a world where you're just kind of shooting from the hip, as we say. And I think it's a global, phrase, but you end up just kind of like guessing and checking your way to success. And so in the early days, you're never going to have, or in rare form, you're going to have perfect data. And so in the early days, you are chasing that qualitative kind of loop, but you're making sure that you have a feedback loop for the decisions you're making or the tests that you're running. And then you're using your intuition. You're like trying to gather as much as humanly possible. And I think it's a good kind of metaphor for, building a company, whether you're a founder or an executive, which is, oh, I constantly have to know that this is a fool's errand, but the only way that I'm going to get to the non-fool's errand is to, kind of like throw this stuff up against the wall, try to read the tea leaves, and then do it again. And then the next time I do it, hopefully I have more data. And then you kind of like, for lack of a better phrase, vector your way into success. And so I think that's kind of how I think about it at a really high level. The thing with data though, too, is I'm actually not, I'm kind of in a sweet spot when it comes to data. Like I'm not a PhD level, like anything, but I've always been seeking kind of leverage for the decisions we're making. And so when you kind of combine that with first principles thinking, you start to get into a position where you rationalize really, really well. And as long as you have that feedback loop, sometimes you rationalize correctly, and then sometimes you go really, really wrong. But as long as you have that loop, it's fine to kind of adjust. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I think about data, especially in the early days.
I'd love to hear a story of where it's gone right surprisingly and where it's gone horribly wrong.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because as execs and founders, like you don't really remember the things that went wrong, right? Or you don't remember them as dramatically as you should. This is what it's always interesting when you're thinking of like what went terribly wrong, right? Well, if I thought it I thought it was going terribly wrong at the time, but I got past it, and therefore I rationalize why it's not terrible, right? Like my emotions are like, well, it wasn't that bad because I got past it, right? And we're fine now and we're doing well. And so it's a little bit harder. I think one thing I think we got right was there's two big things. One is still paying off, but one is paid off enough to be like, yes, that was the right decision. We were helping, we had this pricing product. That was our first product. We were helping a large company basically with, they were about to go public, and we were helping them with their pricing using our software. And they had said, or we discovered as this outside vendor, that they were calculating their MRR and their churn completely incorrectly. So imagine a company's about to go on their roadshow, like for their IPO, to go raise a couple $100 million, and their churn is being calculated incorrectly, right? It seems like idiotic, like, right? And it wasn't like, oh, there's a lot of ways to calculate churn. It was like, no, the way you think you're calculating it is not the way you're actually calculating it, right? And so we thought we were brilliant. We thought, oh my God, this is the idea. We'll create this metrics dashboard. No one's ever thought of an analytics dashboard for subscription companies, right? And then all of a sudden there were like 30 other companies as we started developing this. And so what we ended up doing is we kind of stopped and we did the customer development, that thing that everyone gives you advice to do, and only 20% of you do it. Is we went out and we were like, oh, let's just go like study a little bit. And we talked to like 300 people, and we did it through a survey. And I think we talked to like 30 of those people, like actually one-on-one. And we just discovered that our assumptions about what people were willing to pay for this product were completely wrong. That meant that we needed to go up market with that product, or we needed to find a different product, or give the product up, or go free, which is ultimately what we did. And that's the thing where we got into this nice like virtuous circle of more data means our paid products get better, which means we make more money, which means we get more free, and then so on and so forth. So that's where it went really well. I think where it's gotten us in trouble, and it's not quite data, but it's definitely like the data that you have. People are terrible. Like, not people are terrible, that's like a little aggressive, but like HR and people ops is so freaking hard, but we think it's easy because we're humans. So dealing with other humans, that must be easy, right? And then all of a sudden, this person you think you have a great relationship with, and this has happened, multiple times because you have this weird work dynamic. the person you think you have a great relationship with, they're like, oh, I'm going to go find this other job. And you're like, oh, why? Like, I thought everything was great. And they're just like, no, I hate you. Right. They don't say it like that, but you get what I'm saying? Like, that's how you kind of take it sometimes. Right. And when you take it like that, and I think just in people ops in general, when you're trying to get data, at least even qualitatively, on what's going on with like internal like culture, you're trying to like really push it forward, you start to realize that there's not a lot of good data when it comes to kind of people ops. And so you almost have to structure a system and then defend the system at all costs and not try to chase like, oh, if we do this, productivity will increase this, or happiness will increase this, or attrition will be better in this case. And I think that's one place where we tried to like use some of our more data or first principle mindset, and it was better off just to basically apply it in terms of a system rather than something that's more quantitative.
What does that system
Which
look
I know.
like?
Oh, the system. So it's not perfect quite yet, but it's basically so some really good advice I got, and it's I'm sure a lot of people have said this at this point. You don't have values as a company unless you have trade-offs with your values. And so we were or I personally was like, oh, everyone needs to like me. I need to accommodate everybody. Like, oh, this person complained about this. Like, oh, I failed as a CEO, like, especially in the early days. And some of you have the opposite problem. Some of you have like, and we all kind of have both these problems at some point in our company where you're like, screw all these people, like we're going to be fine, right? Which is not the right attitude either. And so the system that we kind of set up is we really think through, at least for our leadership team, like what are the things that make us great? Like what are the things that make us great, or what are the things we're good at? And let's kind of read from those, like what are the values that we think the company should be going forward with, and then just defend them voraciously. And so some of those things that we like think about that are, I guess, have trade-offs or a little more controversial. Like we're a big feedback culture. This whole concept we have is feedback is non-negotiable. And that gets us in trouble sometimes because sometimes people, and the way you receive feedback is very negotiable, to be clear. But sometimes people, they're like, yeah, I want feedback. And then you're giving them feedback and it turns out like they actually don't want as much feedback as they think they do, right? That happens with a lot of people, especially people that come from corporate, because they're not getting really any feedback except maybe a couple times a year. And then all of a sudden they're getting like random people that report to them being like, I didn't really like the way that email looked because it wasn't great. And they don't know how to handle that type of feedback, right? Some other things, we have this whole concept of the most charitable interpretation. So if, you're talking to me and you say like, you make a joke and you're clearly trying to joke with me, but like, I'm offended by it. And there's a lot of things that are clearly wrong that like, that's not what we're talking about. We're kind of talking about like, oh, you didn't know I was very sensitive about that topic. Like, I'm not, here and being like, hey, like, you're wrong. How dare you do that? You didn't know, right? And you had good intentions and you're trying to talk to me and joke around with me. Like, I should give you the most charitable interpretation and then talk to you and be like, hey, Jackie, like, I don't know if you know this, like, I don't really like when you joke about cows. Like, it really like bothers me, right? And like, that's a controversial concept now, which is kind of crazy, right? And so we have a bunch of other things that we like really think about. We have a pretty disagreeable culture. And again, that a lot of people think like, oh, that means volatility. It doesn't mean volatility. It just means like, hey, like you're expected to like look for problems. You're expected to talk about those problems. And, we learned really quickly that that's not a culture that everyone wants. And that's totally fine. It doesn't mean they're wrong and we're right. It just means that like, we're not a good fit. And so I think that's the system that's really important to kind of set up, is like, make sure your culture has trade-offs.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think, like you say, it's kind of easier said than done. But I like that most charitable interpretation. I think, like you say, everyone's human and everyone speaks without thinking sometimes. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. I just a question from the audience, just to jump in quickly, to move back to kind of the early days of ProfitWell, I guess, when it was priced intelligently. Around, you mentioned you discovered customers weren't willing to pay for the metrics product. Curious how you tested this pricing and established it. Was, I guess, what was the framework for your customer development?
Yeah, totally. So on a very high level, and there's a lot of people have written on like general customer development. My kind of shorthand is I have a core question or a thesis, whatever it is, right? I want to go to probably 10 to 15 people qualitatively on Zoom at this point. Maybe it's in person at some point as well again. And I want to kind of be a prosecuting attorney, if you will. I want to kind of not lead them. I don't want to lead the witness, if you will, but I kind of want to learn, right? I want to talk to them about the problem. I never want to ask questions like, this feature is kind of cool, right? Like, do you agree? Like, those are bad questions. Or, hey, what do you think we should have, right? Like, I want to ask like really broad questions like, hey, like when you think about solving this problem, like what are your thoughts, right? Like super broad, and I might get narrow as things go on, but it's a very like wishy-washy conversation. And I just want to be careful that I don't lead the witness, as I said. From those 10 to 15 conversations, depending on your question. So let's imagine it's a pricing, like how much is the willingness to pay for? I'm probably going to start to get a little bit of a thesis of like, all right, I'm in this range. And the pricing questions that I think are really powerful. And there's a lot of ways to ask your audience willingness to pay. The one that I found very, very efficient, meaning like the cost is low enough for the output that you typically get. And there's other ways that cost a lot more and you might get better output, but they cost a lot more in terms of time and even cash in some cases, is something known as Van Westendorp. So I can send materials on this. You don't have to remember that. But the basic idea is, or the innovation that this economist out of the Netherlands came up with was basically we as humans, and psychologists and economists have studied this for a long time, we think about value as a spectrum. So we know that like this computer is worth more than, this bottle of water next to me. Now, if you put me in the desert for 3 days without water, all of a sudden that value differential changes, right? And so our value differential for different items depends on, how much money we make, if we bought those items before, a whole host of things, right? So I can ask questions. And if I'm in these one-on-one meetings, I can ask things like, okay, great. So we've seen the product and you showed them the product, or you showed them whatever you want a reaction on, basically a landing page of worth of information. For that product, at what monthly price is this way too expensive that like, you're just not going to return my email or my call? And let them struggle, let them like give you a bunch of numbers and these types of things. And then I want to ask, okay, at what point is it such a good deal? Like, you give me your credit card right now, and then let them struggle and like they'll answer these types of things. And over 10 to 15 people, it's not quantitative, it's not super scientific, but you have a methodology where I at least start to get a range. Am I a $10 product? Am I a $100 product? Am I a $1,000 product? That's the question you're trying to answer in the early days. You're not trying to answer, am I $19 or $20? I see a lot of early stage folks get caught up on that. Even like Series B and C folks can sometimes get caught up on that when they haven't just figured out like the general range. What I then want to do, and this is the second big step of the process, is I want to go wider. So I want to go to 150 to 300 people through a survey. And I want to ask the two questions I mentioned, but two more questions. At what point is it getting expensive, but you'd still consider purchasing it? And then really important, particularly for Aussie and New Zealand companies in particular, at what point is it too cheap that I'd question the quality of it? And I'll explain why that's really important for Aussies and New Zealand folks for a second. But those four questions, if you use the standard Van Westendorp analysis, you're going to get kind of plus or minus about 20-25% of reality, which again is not like, if you're some brand new thing that no one's ever heard of, you're probably going to get a really wide range. If it's like transactional email, you're probably going to get a pretty narrow range that you can then kind of make a decision off of. But if you then want to kind of make it a little more complicated, the calculations, I would recommend kind of throwing out the standard calculations and kind of go from there. Now, to my point, and this is kind of the model. So we did this basically, and we discovered two big things. One, the willingness to pay from our target customers was basically a third of what we thought it was. So what happened is our projected unit economics for this product, meaning our customer acquisition costs and what we thought our lifetime value was going to end up being, ended up being all out of whack. So this business where we were like, oh, we're going to get the 3-to-1 LTV to CAC and all this other stuff, it was terrible. Like, it was just terrible. And then the other thing that we found out is our smallest customers and our largest customers, at least targeting at the time, it was only like a 3 to 5x difference between the two. So like HubSpot was only willing to pay like 3 to 5 times the amount of like Johnny or Jane's startup. And whenever you have that phenomenon, I don't care what business you're in, it's terrible because you're not going to get any upgrade revenue. You're not going to get any expansion revenue, no matter what you build. And so the TLDR is like most companies should do a little bit of this research as early as possible, because you end up basically, hitting your head against the wall and doing it in a way that is not productive. And all of a sudden, like, you end up building a company that wastes a lot of time and a lot of money. And if you can raise 100 million, fine, don't do the research. I've seen plenty of people like waste a lot of money collecting the wrong kind of customer. But a lot of us aren't going to have that opportunity. Now, why Aussies and Kiwis should ask that last question. I don't want to speak too generally, and generalizations they're always wrong on an individual basis, but maybe right on a general basis, right? It's the tall poppy syndrome, which I know you all have talked about at some point. You all don't think your stuff's worth anything. And you also, like, every time I meet an Australian, and really it's like European companies as well, it's like, oh, we're not San Francisco, we're not the US, like our products aren't worth as much. And it's like every single time I end up seeing products that, when people triple or quadruple the price, not only does their revenue per customer go up, but their conversion goes up, because people go, oh, like, you were claiming to do all those things for $10 a month. I didn't believe you. I thought you were just some crappy startups trying to steal my money. But now you're trying to charge me $50 a month. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what everyone else is charging, right? So it's a big thing to kind of think about. And obviously it's not, universal, but I would say that that's a really big thing that happens is y'all underprice a lot. Everyone kind of underprices, but Australia and New Zealand, as well as kind of certain parts of Europe, are very much like that as well, at least relative to the US.
Yeah, I've always thought that Aussie and Kiwi companies, it's much harder to get to $1 million of revenue, because your customer base here as well is just less innovative often than the early customers you get in the US. But if you get there, you've done it in a really scrappy way with a much harder customer base than you would have. And so to go from 1 to 10 to 100 is actually much easier probably than the US counterpart. I guess. One of the things that I'd love to go into from there is, you were mentioning unit economics there. And I think one of the things that we often see early founders make a mistake on is like understanding what customer acquisition or like go-to-market strategy you should have based on the actual unit economics over time, and like whether that's kind of initial ACV or whether that's kind of your get in, land and expand. Can you just talk a bit more about how you think about go-to-market channels in the context of unit economics, and what different companies should do, and maybe how they should think about it early on?
Yeah, I think I don't know the ages of everybody or how long you've been in the game for the audience here, but I think when you think about a lot of the advice that we're getting, we're getting, this is changing a little bit, but as we were all coming up, a lot of the advice we were getting was like based in like 2000 to 2010, basically advice, right? Like, oh, this is how it was successful in 2000 to 2010. Therefore, this is how it should be successful now. And it's not that you don't stand on the shoulders of giants as you iterate, but the problem is that this is where product market fit came from. Product market fit was very much, we have a product. The hard thing to do was build the product. Now let's go find a market. And there's just not a lot of products out there. So it'll be easy to like find this market. We won't have a ton of competition and everything will be great. And then we'll just throw money at every single channel that opens up, because we have all these brand new marketing channels opening up every quarter, and it's amazing and everyone's getting rich. It's awesome, right? Problem is, and I talk about this a lot, we haven't had a brand new marketing channel since 2015. That was Snapchat. It's not really applicable to most of us. TikTok may be a new one. And this is why we're all reinventing marketing channels. We're reinventing, email and sales, which is ABM. We're reinventing inbound marketing, which is the media strategy you referenced. And so this is where, and I think Brian Balfour was the first one to talk about this, is like, it's that market product channel fit. And that's kind of what you're referencing, which is like, what's a market you're going after, then figure out what that product is. And then as you kind of get that product market fit or market product fit, depending on how you want to put it, then it's like, where are those customers? And I think not enough people put enough kind of stock in like, how are you going to build your customer base? And I think a lot of times that's TAM based, because right now we have our logo TAM. There's only about 100 to 150,000 subscription companies in the world. I don't know if anyone knew that, but like, there's not a lot. The revenue on those is exponential. So when we looked at this ourselves, we thought, okay, like direct is not going to work. Like, we're not going to be able to get search ads to be our demand gen, to be our primary channel. And ultimately, we needed a go-to-market strategy that hinged not only on sales, but also hinged on content and brand. And there's a bunch of things that we can talk about there. So I don't know, in a long rambly way, I think that the biggest thing is to figure out where your customers are. Most of you, if you're going mid-market and enterprise, are going to need some sort of multi-touch, and that's going to rely on heavy sales as well as heavy content. And then there's a lot of you who can use like referral programs, word of mouth, et cetera. But it's just kind of following where that customer is, and it's just an extension of product market fit.
All right, well, let's maybe chat a bit more about I guess your go-to-market and how you've, I guess, evolved those channels over time. I think one of the questions that came up before we jumped on today was talking about free trial versus freemium. And you talked a bit about how the metrics product kind of feeds in and gives you data to enable you to upsell to new customers. Could you have a chat like a bit about how you think about freemium versus free trial and who should do which?
Yeah, I used to be very against freemium. So this is the other thing, right? So CAC is going up for everything. CAC's up about 70, customer acquisition costs up about 70% over the past 6-7 years. So customer costs you $100 6-7 years ago, they're now costing you 170. And some channels are better than others. And the channels that are kind of still going up, but kind of defending themselves a bit, are things like content, as well as things like freemium. And the reason freemium works really well, and it wasn't always like this, is that, and now I'm a big advocate of freemium, is freemium puts the onus of conversion on your customer rather than the onus of conversion on you in some artificial timeline. And the reason that's so important is because with this like rise of competitors, this compression that's happened with acquisition channels, you're seeing basically a world where you need higher and higher quality things to bring those customers in. And it used to be like, oh, we'll just write better content, right? And this is where blog posts went from 800 words to like 2,000 words, right? Oh, this 10x content that everyone was talking about. Well, to kind of connect some of the dots, like some of the best content you have is your actual product, right? That's something that people are willing to sign up for. And if they get value, all of a sudden they start to get, washed over with your brand, but also there's some triggers that you can pull in order to get that person to convert to a paying customer. And so the result is that freemium, some of the numbers here, NPS for those customers who convert from freemium tend to be about double than those who convert from like a cold sale. CAC is, I think, about 30 to 40% lower than those who convert from a cold sale. And retention tends to be about 15, 20% higher than those who convert from a cold sale. And what I recommend doing is with freemium is there's a lot of ways you can do freemium. There's a faux free trial, which is basically, hey, you get 20 opens a month, and your target customer, they're going to get through those 20 opens in the first 14 to 21 days. And that's kind of like their time when they're going to get hit up to convert. But if they're not your target customer, they're not ideal, that number resets at the end of the month. And basically you get to nurture that lead. So the best thing to look at is you ought to make sure you're looking at your freemium conversion almost like a cohort basis. Because I want to see like, oh, they converted 3 months in, 4 months in, 5 months in, et cetera. That's something that like really shows like the power of freemium. You're not just focused on those first 30 days conversion. And then there's forever free, which is basically what ProfitWell is, where it's like you can use this product no matter how large you are forever for free. And then we're going to sell you like add-ons. But the reason it's more powerful than free trial is that a free trial is basically, it's not quite the equivalent, but it's basically the equivalent of that salesperson being like, all right, you ready to convert? You ready to convert? Oh, no? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next sale, right? They're not getting any more attention, right? You're kind of forcing that person out of the product again. And in some cases, you want to combine the two, depending on like your actual model. But I think the big thing is like freemium is kind of where the future is going. But it doesn't mean that you don't have enterprise sales. I think you're going to see more and more larger companies have some sort of freemium offering that attracts their target customer, but then they end up selling them, something almost completely different as their actual product. So hopefully that's helpful. There's just a little bit of rundown on freemium.
Yeah, I think that is really helpful. One of the things I've always thought about freemium as well is that it needs to be really intentional, because the people who just open up their product for free for 2 weeks and then get surprised when people don't know how to use it, or it's too complex or whatever, it just becomes really hard. It's like you need to be super thoughtful about the first mile in a freemium product and making it really simple for people to get up to speed without your help. And get to whatever that value point is, where they feel like, as soon as they hit value, you start asking them for money and they feel like there's like no way that they can turn it off. Notion did that to me so well.
Yeah. I don't think, for most companies, unless you have a top 50 growth person in the world or a clear marketplace that needs freemium, you shouldn't start off with freemium. Too many people, like, they read a product-led growth article and then they're like, oh, let's do freemium. And it's like, no. Like what you said is really important. Like you have to sweat that precipice between free and paid. And until you have someone who's like, from a product perspective or a conversion perspective, is focused entirely on that metric, you shouldn't be doing it, because it just increases your noise considerably. And I'm actually, so to kind of tie a couple questions together, if you're just starting out, I would actually recommend what you should do for your first 6 to 12 months. And this is assuming you're a B2B SaaS. Go figure out how to sell your 3 and 4 figure MRR deals exclusively. Go try to find like that $400 a month person, that $300 a month person, that $1,000 a month person. If you're going to be using like a non kind of sales model, and if you're doing a sales model, then probably anything above, $500 a month. That's what you should focus on. And the reason for that is that's where there's the most constraints, right? And that's where, like, yes, you're not going to get like the dopamine of that customer that probably isn't a good customer starting to use your product, but you're going to be able to like really learn the most of people paying, for lack of a better phrase, real money. And again, it's going to be different depending on your product. Your equivalent might be $100. That's going to be your biggest customer, your mid customer. But that's what I would have done if we did it all over again, is I would have just spent all my time there, rather than chasing down different things and kind of marketing to learn about my customer. I would have like exclusively focused on who is my mid customer, if not my high customer, and then kind of iterated from there.
And I guess almost the other way around, from, I guess, the people who have figured out enterprise and now want to go down market to self-serve. A question here from Francois, like, how do you build a broader self-service offering for your enterprise customers, like for your existing enterprise product?
Yeah, very carefully. So I think, so you got to really understand your DNA, and that's the hardest part. Is I think that we thought, and this was before we did enough research into like our TAM. We were like, oh, let's just like, we're gonna get a bunch of like $50 customers. It's gonna be awesome, right? The problem is our DNA was really good at selling, these high 3-figure, low 4-figure into like, mid 5-figure deals. And it was one of those things where it was like, why mess up everything for some DNA that you don't have, right? So that's the big thing. So like, the first thing is like, should you do this? That's the big question. And should you do this not from a, oh, look at all those like other customers down there. Like, do this from like are we set up to do this? Or do we realize how much work it's going to be to like shift or open up another team? Assuming you've done that, I think that the best way to kind of push to a self-serve is to either start coming down, meaning like, all right, we're at $100,000 deals. Let's go to 80,000, 50,000, so on and so forth, like, and do that gradually, or just jump to the end, literally jump to the end and be like, here's our $100 a month offering. And the reason, like, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. If my DNA of my company isn't as good, or I'm just not going to have good people down on the lower end because we just haven't done that before, and I don't know how to hire for that and all these other things, I want to bring this gradually down because I'm going to start to learn like, okay, this type of AE, they can handle this type of deal, but they can't handle this type of deal. We got to get a different type of AE in here, et cetera. But if I have that DNA and I'm, probably well funded, or I have like good, cash flow, I might just hire someone right away and like put that like leadership headcount right on this like bottom end plan, because of some, overarching strategy. Now, a couple of other things, like the buying motion is going to be different. Obviously, the pricing is going to be different. And those are the things that I would spend some time on before I jump in. And that also helps convince people internally, your board, investors, whoever it is, like come with the actual, maybe not even data, but just the actual strategy that's been battle tested a little bit. And maybe you did a couple of minimum viable tests, or you have a pilot or something like that going on where it's the same product, you're just charging someone less for it. And that's not your intention, but at least that's a starting point. It's just, again, like, and I'm not saying the person who asked this question is saying this, but like, don't just like read that article and be like, we got to go down market, product-led growth, right? You have to kind of use it as an overarching part of your strategy.
Something I'd love to jump into, because this is something I'm really kind of passionate about, and I think people don't talk about enough, is the reason some companies in the public markets are trading at like 40, 50 times revenue, which by the way, I don't think it's sustainable long term, but the reason they're there is this kind of concept, I think, of net revenue retention. The idea that like essentially your existing customers, if you're Twilio, that's 130%. If you're Snowflake, I think it's 145%. As your existing customers are going to pay you 30 to 50% more every year. And so you have this kind of baked in growth that isn't going to cost you a huge amount to get. And I think, very best SaaS companies we back, like net revenue retention is almost like that kind of gold star that comes along that we look for. And so I'm kind of really interested to hear, I know you've talked about expansion and churn a ton. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what companies should be thinking about.
Yeah. To kind of, I've been talking about pricing for a long time now. And I kind of quipped earlier, there's like only 20% of you who are actually going to do like the research. And I've come to terms with that. I thought I could convince you, but I've kind of come to terms with it. I think the market will like push people into a place of like actually doing that research. But that being said, like there's two fundamental things. And this is kind of like putting some cheese on the broccoli. So it's like, here, I was trying to feed you broccoli, but like, let me give you like the things that like, there's two things you need to do. First, if you're a B2B SaaS company, and even if you're a consumer subscription company or even a hardware, SaaS hybrid or something like that, you need to figure out your value metric. Your value metric, your pricing metric, it's how you charge per user, per 1,000 visits, per dollar retained, whatever it is. The reason that this is so powerful is that you bake expansion revenue and lower churn into how you make money. I come in, I get 5 users. When I want 10 users, I pay you more. If I only need 7 users, I don't churn, but I definitely like downgrade a little bit, which is better than churn. I'll take that, right? So in every single metric, this is the thing that hedges and leverages you against yourself and your own ignorance or your own like mistakes that you're going to make just in the nature of building a company. It's the one thing that separates growth from non-growth when we look at every other factor. So that's the one thing that you should focus on in the early stage. And if you haven't focused on it in your later stage, congrats, but this is the thing that'll accelerate you even further. The other thing that kind of addresses what you're talking about is the most underutilized mid to late stage or like tail end of the early stage pricing / growth thing, we'll say, for lack tactic, there we go, is add-ons. Add-ons are not quite full extra products you're selling to your customer, but they're additional features or just even like priority support or these types of things that I can sell someone who's already happy with me and they're more than willing to pay me more based on some sort of like value exchange. I already have this customer, they're happy, I might as well like, basically sell them more things. And the really great way to figure out, or kind of a heuristic to think about, it's not perfect, but if I have a group of customers like a tier, or I have just my whole subset or something like that, and 40% or less of that particular group are using a particular feature, that's a really good candidate to pull out and probably sell to the entire customer base. And there's other ways you can figure out add-ons, but that helps you get that expansion revenue. And I think when you look at people who are really high multiples, at least some of the ones recently, and some of them I can speak to publicly, some of them I can't, because they're users, but like they typically have heavy expansion revenue that's driven by a value metric and driven by some sort of add-on strategy, even if it's just a really simple, like we sell priority support to everybody and 20 to 30% of people buy it, but they buy it at a high enough price that we get to that 120, 130. I do think the multiples are a little out of control, but like the multiples will always be higher if you have better net retention. And depending on your industry, this is what gets interesting. And maybe it's actually not that interesting, but like you kind of brought this up, which I think is worthwhile, is like, if you're in the consumer space, your net retention might be like 100%, like your net, because you have a lot of churn, and that might be like top of the market. And that's amazing, right? If you're in B2B SaaS, you kind of got to be pushing like at least 105, if not, much more. So yeah, it's just something to think about.
I think it might be good to kind of talk through that concept of understanding your value metric in the context of your company, and maybe retain could be a good product for talking about, I guess, how you price, like how you think about pricing that way. So I'd love to get you to talk through that.
Yeah. So there's like 3 or 4 steps, and you're still going to have to like earn your paycheck. Like there's going to be no perfect answer. So you're going to have to like figure it out. First thing you want to do, it doesn't matter if you can measure it, just what is the perfect metric to price on, or what is the perfect measurement of value that your customer gets? So if you're a B2B product, it's probably money you bring them, money you save them, time you save them, these types of things. There's not a lot right with the world of B2B. If you're a consumer product, it might be joy. It might be humor. It might be fun. Again, you can't always measure, right? Although there's an example I like to use. There's a theater in Barcelona that for a while actually had AI cameras on the seat in front of you, and they measured how much you laughed. And then they showed you a price based on how much you laughed. And then they showed you a price that was flat rate. You got to choose basically, but it was more of a performance thing, but there's a lot more things you can measure than you think. But what is the perfect thing? So HubSpot, it's money that HubSpot brings you through the marketing software. For retain, it's the amount of money we recover for you over your baseline. If you can measure that number and you can get your customer to agree to it, which is oftentimes the harder part, that should be your value metric. You have the ability to have a very perfect value metric, and retain, basically, we're able to measure it. We can get our customer to agree to it. And therefore, like that's our value metric, is the amount of money we recover. 10% of you are going to be able to do that. I think that number is going to go up, particularly as we can measure things more. This is where like usage or usage-based pricing is getting more and more popular. For most of us, we then want to find a proxy for that value metric. So HubSpot, it's money they bring you through their marketing software. Then what we want to do is, what are the 5 to 10 things that are a proxy for that marketing dollars that they bring us? Because I can't really decide if HubSpot actually, like, was it me writing the blog post? Was it their automation and email? Like, who was actually at fault there or successful there? So proxies for HubSpot might be per user, per visits, number of visits, per contacts, per page views, features, functionality, right? So I'm going to come up with 5 to 10 proxies. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go talk to my customers. I'm going to go talk to some people and I'm going to say, hey, you've been using this product for a while. We're thinking of our pricing, or hey, we're thinking of redoing our pricing, or hey, I want to get your take on XYZ. And I want to go to people who've never heard of me and I want to explain what the product is. And I want to say, okay, when it comes to pricing, we're going to use something called max diff here, which is just a model where we're going to say, of these 5 or 10 ways to price, so whittle it down probably to 5, what is your most preferred pricing and what is your least preferred pricing in that group? And you'll start to see in most products that you'll have like some coalescing around one of those particular metrics. So for HubSpot, it mostly comes back as number of contacts. That's how most people prefer to have their pricing, even if they've never heard of HubSpot. It's not an anchoring thing. It's just how a lot of people think about marketing automation products. And then I want to measure willingness to pay somehow. And the reason I want to measure willingness to pay is I want to make sure that people who have lots of contacts are willing to pay more than people who don't have a lot of contacts. I want to make sure that metric basically is linear or whatever kind of curve you want with the number of contacts and with the willingness to pay. Then what I want to do is I kind of want to make a product decision, and I want to look at the actual data in my database, and I want to do another gut check and see, okay, do people who presumably are going to pay more, do they have more contacts or not? Because sometimes what you find, everyone wants per user, but everyone only has one user. It's probably not a good value metric. And sometimes in B2B products, this is where you get into trouble, particularly for analytics products. I am so sorry for anyone here who's an analytics product. It's very hard product to price. This is why everyone goes up market, because, okay, per user, it kills my retention because I don't get enough people in the product. Per dollar amount or per amount of data, well, now no one wants to put all the data that they have inside the product, right? I think it's super complicated. This is why they always go up market. But through those kind of 4 main steps, I now have enough information to kind of earn my paycheck and make a decision. And you can kind of go back and be like, hey, this is what we're going to do. What do you think if you want to get some more data? But normally you figure it out. And then the way you set your tiers or the way you set kind of your ramp for how you're going to charge is typically based on a histogram analysis where you're just like, oh, there's this group that has up to 1,000 contacts. There's a group that has up to 3,000 and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the steps that I would take. And I've written some stuff on this that I can ship over as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. And we'll steal all those documents from you after this, and then we can send them around with the recording. So everybody sign up to the Airtree newsletter, and we'll send those around afterwards. Just to change gears a little bit, Ryan here has asked a question about, he says, super interested in your content strategy, how you figured out what buyers you were targeting, and any learnings on content schedule, timing, frequency. I think it might be kind of really interesting to talk through this in the context also of like your evolving kind of media strategy and what and how you've thought through, I guess, targeting users through that, or targeting your different segments that way.
Totally. So here's the basic idea, just for sake of time. 3 years ago, we started, it was just me writing blog posts. I wrote a blog post a week. I sent it out. We were kind of lucky that we were in a space with pricing and retention, especially, 8 years ago, where anything you wrote, people were like, oh my gosh, this is genius. Thank you so much. Right? Like the actual pricing people, they were like, this is the most basic stuff ever. But everyone else who didn't know anything, they're like, yeah, I never took a class on this. I don't know what I'm doing. And so it was like, we could write really basic stuff. Not that we thought it was basic. It just was, it was, people were craving education. And this is the classic inbound marketing strategy. So we started, kind of doing inbound, and it was just blog post a week, ebook, kind of the classic playbook there, where you drive people to the ebook, then you get them on a drip campaign. And then, every blog post you basically send to your list. What ended up happening is we then decided like, oh, we should like grow up and have a proper marketing team. And this is what happened 3 years ago. And what was kind of fascinating is we started noticing that the effectiveness of our inbound strategy started going down. And this was mainly because we at one point were sending 2 blog posts a week, and we started noticing like our unsubscribe rates were going up for the double sends. We did a bunch of analysis, and the only kind of conclusion was that basically, our effectiveness was going down. And so when we were kind of putting a marketing team together, we wanted to figure out what was the best strategy for us, like what was our best go-to-market strategy. And we basically found, and I can share some of this data, but we found that the next leverage kind of echelon in content was the media strategy. So put another way, media companies are the best in the world at driving traffic. They are the worst in the world at monetizing the traffic, but software companies tend to be really good at monetizing traffic. And so to give you a couple numbers, like the average cost of an ebook, like a real ebook, not like just a PDF blog post, is probably about $10,000 in time and materials. We kind of calculated it, and we verified this over time, that the average, kind of cost of a season of a show, so like 13 episodes of a show, was going to cost about $10,000. When we look at kind of the average touch points per week of a lead, classic inbound strategy for B2B, like 1.6, for like a business Bloomberg kind of business publication, it's like 5.8, right? So you're starting to see like this narrative that if you can figure out kind of the unit economics of, you know, content in a media context, it was actually more beneficial. And then the other thing was, and this is what the difference is, to be really clear about it, basically what you're doing with inbound is you're creating that offer and then you're creating a bunch of stuff to drive people to an offer. With media, you're building audience. So you have different shows, right? So we have a show called Pricing Page Teardown, where when it's in season, every week it's us talking about pricing pages and data. And you might be thinking, that sounds terrible. Like, who would ever want to watch that? We have 100,000 people a month when that's in season watch that show, right? Which is insane, right? If you really think about it, right? And this is why like everyone and their mother has a podcast, is because like, oh, I can try to get my best webinar to have 50 people on it, you know, for a lot of companies, or I can get 500 people a week to listen to me like ramble about something, right? That's so much better for brand, right? And so we basically set out with this thesis of, all right, let's figure out how to mechanically create a show at a low cost, because we're not going to like throw 30 people at this. We don't have HubSpot money or something like that. And then what we're going to do is let's basically create a show. And this is kind of like, we didn't get there right away. We like stumbled to this. So it's not like, oh, this is great and it was perfect. But let's create a show for each cross section of our personas or our verticals and our products. So what I mean by that is we have a pricing product, and we serve B2B SaaS companies, consumer subscriptions, which includes like media and fitness and a bunch of other things, and then subscription e-commerce. So we were going to have a show for each of those particular things on pricing. We're going to have a show for each of those particular things on retention, and then we're going to have a general show for each of those as well, which is like very top of the funnel content. And so right now we have 6 shows, I think. We've kind of built up to it. Some more successful than others. Some are video and audio, some are just audio, some are still written. But we're building audience versus, you know, just doing this, you know, wheel strategy. And we still do the wheel strategy in SEO, but it's one of those things where audience has such bigger payoff for conversion as well as for a whole host of things. So it's kind of a really rambly like version of the strategy. I made a post public that was internal. I published like, hey, this is what we did and why we did it. So I can send it over if that makes sense.
Yeah, would love to see that. I actually read it over the weekend, and
oh, nice.
I love when people open up their internal docs, because it's whether or not it's been heavily edited, it always feels pretty authentic. So yeah. Thank you for that.
Totally.
I don't want to hold up anyone any longer. I know I said I'd keep to an hour, and so I will do my best to. This has been great. I could ask you questions for another hour. For everybody on the call, thank you to you for joining. Please sign up for our newsletter, and you'll get the recording and also all those resources that Patrick mentioned. Thanks so much for joining us, Patrick. I'm going to be
absolutely
peppering with you with questions, I'm sure, many weeks into the future. So thank you.
Yeah, totally. And if you're in the audience and you didn't get what you wanted, I'm a big proponent of evangelism and value. So hit me up on Twitter or something like that. Not LinkedIn. LinkedIn's the worst place to find me in terms of messages, but hit me up on Twitter and I'm more than happy to answer any questions and keep us all moving forward.
I'll piggyback on that. Please never message me on LinkedIn. Twitter's the one. Thanks everybody, and have a great morning. See you later.
Bye everyone.
See everybody.